There have always been women poets, and their themes and passions have been as various as the cultures in which they wrote. So I'm not seeking to describe the nature of poetry written by women in general. However, I've lived through a half-century when the status of women poets has changed out of all recognition. In Britain, 50 years ago, we might be caricatured as spinsterish and faintly comic. Women poets now have a place in the public world. They are professors of poetry in great institutions, and indeed the 3 present poet laureates in these islands are all women. The genders which seemed so immutable in the post-war world have slipped and shifted in the last 50 years. My question this morning is, has the entry of so many fresh voices into the art significantly changed the nature and form of poetry in our time? Should we expect that? I don't have a ready answer, but I have questions and a tentative proposition. Let me start with the thoughts of Evan Boland, one of the finest and boldest poets of the last half-century. I begin with her because no one has articulated with more poise the dilemmas of being a woman poet in Ireland. An early feminist, she wrote with her young children around her, finding poetry among the early morning bottle feeds and necessary chores. She has other powerful themes: emigration, exile, the violence of Irish history, deaths in famine. But at her best, she explores the stoicism of daily life and the intensities of a long marriage. In a recent essay, she asks an important question: why have so few women in the history of poetry been citizen poets? Why have so few set up their poems with country, nation, nationhood, placing themselves at the centre of those themes? At first sight, I thought it a good question. But as I began to think about the women whose poems I have most admired in the last half-century, it seemed to me that concern with the intimate, rather than the social, made for a peculiar integrity. That if poetry these days was less wind-blown by the excitements of the public world, it was possibly no bad thing. In lyric poetry, certainly, which has been the great strength of poetry in the last half-century, an exploration of the personal seems at least to have the authority of lived experience. I use the word self-exposure because I don't like the word confessional, with its kite tale of sin and clerical forgiveness. And of course I know that men are as capable of it. Robert Lowell and John Berryman come to mind. But also, what could be more self-exposing than Larkin's fear of death in Obad, as he contemplates the total emptiness forever, the sure extinction that we travel to and shall be lost in always, not to be here, not to be anywhere, and soon. Nothing more terrible, nothing more true. So I began to wonder whether Boland's observation should not be turned on its head. Women have opened up areas of human experience which are as rich in drama as any battlefield, and have addressed pains and passions as humanly significant as any decided by political struggle. It has not been a half-century rich in political poets, in fact. Tony Harrison, perhaps, or in our present time frame, Sean O'Brien. The politics of identity, that of black or other ethnic groups, are as important these days as any other civic struggle has been. In this, the voice of women, not a minority, certainly, but surely a group which needed to assert its worth, was a potent example. And it would be surprising if such a shift in attention had not made some change in the form of poetry itself. When I began to write poems as an adult in the Great Britain of the 1950s, poetry was written largely by men who had more or less abandoned modernism and in some cases turned their backs on poetry written outside these islands. Some memorable poetry came out of that era. Lyrics of Philip Larkin, Thomas Gunn, Ted Hughes, for instance. But Gunn soon made a move to the USA, and his poetry changed there, while Hughes turned to poets from Eastern Europe and Latin America, some of whom he translated brilliantly. There were some notable women practitioners in Great Britain in those days, Elizabeth Jennings and Patricia Beer among them, though I was not much excited by them at the time. For myself, in the early 50s, I was living in a kind of pause, still working, although married with 2 babies. The roles of poet and mother seemed peculiarly opposed, although there were very soon new women novelists and even an adventurous dramatist who were both. One of my earliest poems was A Dream of Spinsterhood. It was to America I looked first. I had been in love with all things American since my wartime adolescence. Raymond Chandler, the American Air Forces Network, black jazz, and American plenty seemed a kind of fabulous paradise seen from the years of post-war austerity. When I was up at Newnham in 1949, there was still some food rationing. Our eggs were often freeze-dried, and our coffee came from bottles. It was to America I looked for models. Emily Dickinson rather than Christina Rossetti, though Rossetti is a more considerable poet than I gave her credit for then. It was the great singing line of early 20th century modernists like Pound I was looking for. The music of syllables set against syllables, as in Cathay, which I still love, even though I have read Pound's wartime broadcasts now and know his residence in a psychiatric hospital not entirely designed to preserve him from a charge of treason. I was excited by Wallace Stevens' propositions, his blackbird and his blue guitar, without seeing how to emulate his sophistication. There were good reasons for me to look outside these islands for poetic mentors. I was born in the north and still spoke with the flat Midland A, Charles Tomlinson wrote about so ruefully. I'd entered Cambridge from a grammar school. My grandparents were Jewish immigrants from Odessa, and being, crucially, a woman, I knew myself altogether at the edge of the literary world. As I started to write, I began to take a perverse pride in being on that periphery. It seemed an appropriate, even an honourable position for a poet. In those days, poetry was not a career, it was a calling. In 1959, some years after graduation, I was offered the chance to edit an issue of the university magazine Cambridge Opinion, while the usual editors worked for their final examinations. I accepted eagerly, because by then I knew exactly what I wanted to do with it. The issue was to be called The Writer Out of Society, and I was going to use American outsiders. While still living in London, I'd picked up the poems of Allen Ginsberg in an early City Lights pocketbook edition of Howl, 1955. In Cambridge, he was not yet a celebrity. I enjoyed his breathless, unpunctuated paragraphs and witty short lyrics, and wrote to him in my new eminence as editor. I received an enthusiastic reply, and soon afterwards he sent me the addresses of a whole network of other American poets, more or less unknown in Britain. Among these was Charles Olson, and I sent him a letter with a few bald questions, signing it, as I remember, E.B. Feinstein, to conceal the fact that I was a woman. In the same year, I started a small literary magazine I called Prospect, which I hoped to finance by increasing the load of supervisions and WEA lecturing I was already engaged in. I had no financial backing. My husband and I, with 2 children, were trying to live on his PhD research grant. So it was through Prospect I briefly became a conduit, more or less by chance, for an American avant-garde not yet much known in England. All of them acknowledged the influence of Ezra Pound, and several of them were as Jewish as I was, outsiders themselves, but ebullient, unfrightened figures. I had no feminist agenda. Among the material I was sent, I selected 3 lovely poems from Denise Levertov, which I published in the first issue. She interested me because she wrote so freely about the things in her local domestic world. I can still remember a line of washed clothes which hung between lemon trees. Would English poets, writing about the beauties of the natural world, have mentioned that line of washing? I very much preferred those poems to her later work about American foreign policy. 1959 was more or less pre-feminist for me. My hard work outside the house was driven entirely by need rather than ideology. If consciousness was being raised in the metropolis, it was not in the Cambridge I inhabited. Later, when I went to the University of Essex as an assistant lecturer in the American Literature Department, thanks to Donald Davey, I became aware of other important voices of women, such as Loreen Nidecker. It was from Essex my own first poems were taken off by Ed Dorn to be published by Cape Goliard. In Essex, too, I met Andrew Crozier and became the only woman in his first issue of the English Intelligencer, put out from the Roneo machine of Caius College, where Jeremy Prynne was a fellow. Those mimeographed sheets remained predominantly male, though outstanding poets such as Veronica Forrest Thompson, Wendy Mulford, and Denise Riley soon had strong connections to the movement. I left the group quite early on, alienated by their search for specifically English roots, which suggested a nationalism I distrusted profoundly, as I wrote in a letter Crozier published. I had by then received my own most important influence from elsewhere. Just a couple of years before Ezra Pound died in Venice, Nadezhda Mandelstam's Hope Against Hope was published and captured the imagination of the Western world. As I tried to recall the quality of excitement with which we read the story of a group of brave people in Stalinist Russia and the love between them, I realized that part of the fascination lay in their central assumption that poetry matters in itself, not as a servant of some other cause. It was their cause. For them, the personal vision was the whole point. It was their response to the agitprop all around them. Poetry mattered because it was a spiritual strength, just as the belief in God might be, and in some ways related to that. As I came to reflect on how rarely such claims were made for poetry in contemporary Western society, I began to wonder if some part of the reluctance to do so went back to our bemused response to the voice of Ezra Pound. When he received the Bollingen Prize for the Pisan cantos, we had somehow to separate our response to his music from his vicious fascism and his broadcasts during the war, which exulted in murder. We could not trust our poets, but Russians felt they could, because they were putting their own lives on the line when they wrote. For me, what made Russian poetry particularly exciting was the discovery that 2 of the 4 poets Nadezhda Mandelstam grouped together in Hope Against Hope were women, both of whom have to be counted among the great European poets of the 20th century. Through them, I learned the personal, which can become political if the emotions are widely shared. Mandelstam's own satirical lampoon of Stalin is a portrait of an ugly, pock-marked tyrant who delights in the murder of peasants, quite impersonal. And it became, indeed, as Pasternak called it, a suicide note. Even those he read it to were endangered by it. Mandelstam is one of the great victims of the age. But that poem, however courageous, was not his best poem. In contrast, the poet of the Soviet era who became a symbol of inner dissidence was Anna Akhmatova, who wrote in the classical tradition of Alexander Pushkin. One might not have predicted this iconic role for the gay little sinner of Tsar Koyeselo, as she called herself. She is far from Ivan Bolan's idea of a political poet. Her early lyrics of unhappy love, which usually focused on one single dramatic moment in a relationship, were known by heart across Russia before the First World War. The very memorability made her work dangerous, as the Soviet government became uneasy about the influence of the arts on politics. She was banned from publication even before she became the voice of a whole nation's suffering in the grip of Stalin's purges. She does not write about the way her country is run. The sequence of lyrics which make up Requiem is powered only by grief and fear. She writes of a single woman watching her husband led away to an unknown fate, as Nikolai Punin was from their flat on the Fontanka, or her son Lev taken into the Gulag for the third time. She dared not mention the poem publicly, or even speak of its existence, in case the ones she loved most would suffer as a result. As the poems were written, 1935 to 1940, Akhmatova and her brave friend Lydia Chukovskaya read and memorized the lyrics of Requiem, and then burned the pages in an ashtray. The sequence was not published until 1967, and even then not in full. It was not a political statement, but it was dynamite. And not because it was written in the first person. In one very moving lyric, she seems to be looking down on herself where she lies on a bed, almost numb with loss. This woman is ill. She is all alone. Her husband is in the grave. Her son in prison. Pray for her. In another, as her stamina fails, she speaks to death. You will come in any case, so why not now? I am waiting. I can't bear any more. I've put the light out and opened the door for you, so simple and miraculous. You may take whatever shape you choose, burst in on me like a gas shell does, or creep in like a bandit with his kosh, or else infect me with a typhus vapour. Sadly, her son Lev hated her for writing these poems. His tormentors in the Gulag liked to mock him with her celebrity, and he, quite mistakenly, believed that if she had tried harder, she could have gotten him released. Not so. But a grimmer childhood anger lies in a cruel sentence he spoke in a quarrel toward the end of her life. It would have been even better for you if I had died. Better for her as a poet, he means, of course. Her fame aroused envy among all the men in her life. Akhmatova's second husband was so jealous of her poetry that he burned her poems in a samovar. Though I've written a biography of Akhmatova, the greatest influence on my own work was the other great Russian poet of the 20th century, Marina Tsvetaeva. She had not made her way into the Western consciousness as Akhmatova had when I first came across her name in Pasternak's autobiography, where he spoke of her rising above all the other poets of his own generation. As Tsvetaeva said from her exile in Paris, where she was drawn to follow her husband, Sergei Yefron, after the Civil War ended in Soviet victory, "Here, no one knows my work because they don't read Russian, and in Russia they don't know me because there are no books." I identified with her because I shared her lack of domestic graces, but also, as Donald Davy wrote in an article in Brigflats long ago, I recognised in her the same tensions of wife, mother, and poet, written dangerously large. Poets like Joseph Brodsky, writing long after her death, honour her as foremost in the Russian pantheon, and it was my great good fortune to bring some of the excitement of her poetry across into English with the help of many generous Russianists. I did not suffer, of course, the tragedies of her life. She lost her mother when she was only 14, and theirs had been an intense relationship. Her mother was a bitter woman, forced to give up the man she loved and to renounce her ambition to become a concert pianist. She put all her passion into educating her precocious daughter, Marina, in French and German literature and the piano. When she died, Marina gave up the piano at once and began to write poetry of such power at the age of 16 that she was known to many leading poets. At 18, Marina met the adolescent Sergei Yefron, an orphaned child of revolutionaries, and they were married in 1912. Little more than children themselves, but soon with a child of their own, the 2 years of their marriage before war broke out in 1914 were the happiest of her life. She was separated from Sergei in the Civil War. He was fighting with the White Army, and she lived through the Moscow famine, becoming very close to her elder daughter Alia, bartering china dishes for potatoes. But her younger girl, Irina, died in the famine. When the Civil War ended and Sergei made his way to Prague, where the Czech government was offering grants so that he could study at the university, she packed up and went eagerly into exile. It was a decision which was to throw her into poverty, even beggary, for the rest of her life. Sergei suffered from TB. She had to take on responsibility for earning the income to keep the whole family alive. Her great poem of the end, about the end of a love affair, taught me the power of abandoning the defence of dignity. In a comparable situation, Akhmatova remains proudly composed in her poetry. Tsvetaeva rips her composure away, as in Lyric 8, where she writes, "It's warm to nestle close at your ribs, to move in a visionary pause, towards nothing, beside nothing, no arms, no legs. Now the bone of my side is alive where it presses directly against you. Adhesive, pressing close to you, Siamese twins are no nearer. The woman you call mother, when she forgot all things, in motionless triumph, only to carry you, she did not hold you closer, and I won't be torn off. As I press close to you, I bite in like a tick. You must tear out my roots to be rid of me." The poet in the Western tradition most obviously comparable in terms of intensity to Tsvetaeva is Sylvia Plath. And it's not just a matter of her last poems. Long before she was betrayed by Ted Hugh's liaison with Ася Wavell, the imagery in her poems is drawn from surgery and hospitals, death and sickness. Although I knew Ted later, I never met Sylvia Plath, whose story echoed so powerfully through the last half of the 20th century. In Russia, I was often asked why Plath had taken her own life, and I outlined all I knew. The adultery, the 2 children, the freezing cold, her depression, and was met with incredulity. Against their history, her misery seemed almost a luxury, and they had no belief in Freudian theory. Plath was a privileged young woman, not entirely abandoned by her husband, in a pleasant Hampstead flat with books and 2 children she adored. Plath's pain was something I could easily share, nevertheless. I can remember experiencing it, though I was never tempted by the thought of death. She is generally seen through the glass of her last poems, written in a great burst of energy. They are ablaze with anger. But neither the transgression nor the anger are new to her. She has been moving toward the expression of it all her writing life. I responded to the fierce, ferocious elation of her language. I acknowledge her genius, even as I mourn the waste of it. Going back to her poems recently, I was struck not so much by the familiar violence of her imagery, but the unusual freedom of her rhythms, the confidence of her spoken voice, the casual destruction of the iamb, and the way this new sound carries the strangest of her propositions. In Tulips, for instance, I didn't want any flowers. I only wanted to lie with my hands turned up and be utterly empty. How free it is. You have no idea how free. Or in the tragic last 2 lines of Mirror, one of my favourite poems. In me she has drowned a young girl, and in me an old woman rises towards her day after day like a terrible fish. Not all her images work as this does, so quietly or so successfully. I'm impatient with her atrocities of sunsets, the glamour of pain and the birthday present of death. But the music is extraordinary. Transgression itself becomes the subject of her poetry, viciousness in the kitchen, the thrill of a cut thumb, the woman in the ambulance whose red heart blooms through her coat so astoundingly this morning. Abstractions take on intimate female characteristics. In the Munich mannequins, for instance, perfection is terrible. It cannot have children. Or again in Edge, in a strange expansion of a similar thought, death becomes the ultimate achievement. The woman is perfected. Her dead body wears the smile of accomplishment. She illuminates an inner landscape with her own scary light, the light of the mind, cold and planetary, or a bone-white light like death behind all things. Daddy, with its stanzaic form and the beat of that persistent rhyme on ooh, avoids the staid iambic rhythms altogether, and the form is as important as the transgressive content. And all this is expressed with a kind of innocence which I suppose is a measure of her sickness. Plath, leaving the horror and the waste of her suicide aside, was a major figure. The electricity of her genius was unmistakable, is unmistakable. Few of those such as Anne Sexton, or even Lowell himself, has written lines which stick so powerfully to the memory. And memorability is one of the most potent tests of poetry's durability. Such an exposure of individual pain mixed with soaring triumph seems far more shocking than writing about the pain of soldiers injured or dying in war, for which compassion or indignation seem appropriate responses. The suffering may be as real, but there is a strong English urge to have the sufferers pull themselves together. And yet, one of the rewards writing poetry offers intelligent women is a way of understanding their inner world. Consider the brilliant American poet Sharon Olds writing about her father's treatment of her, or the ferocity of the pain she endures in her last book when her husband tells her he's leaving her for another woman. Elizabeth Bishop disapproved profoundly of what came to be called confessional poetry. She was appalled by her great friend Robert Lowell using material from the intimate letters he received from Elizabeth Bishop in his poems. She objected in part because Lowell had changed the letters and was thus in danger of mixing and muddling fact and fiction. She writes, "I think one can use one's own life as material, but these letters, aren't you violating a trust? If you were given permission, if you hadn't changed them. But art just isn't worth that much. In general, I deplore the confessional. However, when you wrote life studies, perhaps it was a necessary movement. It helped make poetry more real, fresh, and immediate. But now, ye gods, anything goes, and I am so sick of poems about the students' mothers, fathers, and sex lives, and so on." Much as I admire Bishop, I can't agree. To my mind, it would be a grievous and unnecessary loss to outlaw the personal sources of so much poetry which has moved me. Bishop, though, has a wonderful mastery of tone and exquisite poise. One Art by Elizabeth Bishop. The art of losing isn't hard to master. So many things seemed filled with the intent to be lost that their loss is no disaster. Lose something every day. Accept the fluster of lost door keys, the hour badly spent. The art of losing isn't hard to master. Then practice losing. Farther, losing faster. Places and names, and where it was you meant to travel. None of these will bring disaster. I lost my mother's watch, and look, my last or next to last of 3 loved houses went. The art of losing isn't hard to master. I lost 2 cities, lovely ones, and vaster, some realms I owned, 2 rivers, a continent. I missed them, but it wasn't a disaster. Even losing you, the joking voice, a gesture I love, I shan't have lied. It's evident the art of losing's not too hard to master, though it may look like, write it, a disaster. Her elegance recalls to me the voice of one of the only 3 women who have been awarded a Nobel Prize for poetry. She is a Pole. When she was awarded the prize, I remember many in London thought the prize should have gone to Zbigniew Herbert, who was what we thought poets ought to be then, a member of the resistance against Hitler, much translated, a dissident, often invited to read at literary festivals. Szymborska was none of these things. A much quieter poet, she contemplated an inner world, or certainly her own particular situation, with an amused acknowledgement of her own human limitations. She likes to look at herself rather as Akhmatova did from the outside, but with a wry humour. I'm a tranquilizer. I am effective at home. I work in the office. I can take exams on the witness stand. I mend broken cups with care. All you have to do is take me, let me melt beneath your tongue, just gulp me with a glass of water. I know how to handle misfortune, how to take bad news. I can minimize injustice, lighten up God's absence, or pick the widow's veil that suits your face. What are you waiting for? Have faith in my chemical compassion. You're still a young woman. It's not too late to learn how to unwind. Who said you have to take it on the chin? Let me have your abyss. I'll cushion it with sleep. You'll thank me for giving you 4 paws to fall on. New voices, fresh voices, different from one another, and yet unmistakably an enriching of the stream of what poetry came to mean in the 20th century. And Elaine wanted to finish with a poem of her own called The Gamble, which is from her new book, Portraits, and which encapsulates her feelings about Sylvia Plath. The woman in the mirror, swimming towards you like a terrible fish, never made landfall. Look upon this fin. Observe the lines, the scars, the teeth, the skin. I am old as you will never be. Your life was shorter than Mozart's or Pushkin's. I remember living through the humiliation you were too proud to bear, and now to imagine the motive for your dying troubles me. I honor your carbon paper skies typed through with stars, those winter trees dissolving in their blotting paper clouds. You threw away the last half-century, as if your death could be a deal you cut with genius in return for fame and those ferocious poems blossoming in the unnatural freeze of 63. Was it your legend that demanded blood to prove the violence packed in every lyric was no pretense? Sadly, it was authentic. You could have had the man back in your bed if you'd been willing to endure suspicion. Was hatred cleaner? Did you prefer to damage him when he saw your healthy body dead? What if the doctor's number had been found, and you had woken up to Ted's embrace, seen his remorse? Would a new life begin? Would brushing death have kept him safely bound? Was that the happy end you fell asleep in? Do not rise up now with your red hair to mock an audience which has come to stare at the fairground lady in your story. Explain instead what gamble made you waste your energy and grace and the taste of glory.